In March of 2007, an ecologist employed by a developer was sent down to Fort Myers, Florida to examine a parcel of land. Shortly after arriving, the man discovered a human skull sticking out from the earth. Police arrived and began searching the area, ultimately discovering the full skeletal remains of 8 unidentified men. It didn't take long for detectives to determine that the wooded lot was being used as a dumping ground for a serial killer. In the years since that horrifying find, 3 of the 8 victims have been positively identified through familial DNA and other methods. As the accuracy and speed with which genealogical research can be conducted has increased, cold case detectives started utilizing this new investigative approach, and just this month, they were able to announce that they have positively identified a 4th set of remains as being those of Robert Ronald Sodden, missing since the mid-90s. In addition to this identification, investigators working on a connected case known as the Hog Trail Murders announced last year that they had also positively identified a previously unknown victim found 28 years ago in Charlotte County. This victim was identified as Gerald Lombard, who had gone missing from Lowell, Massachusetts in the early 1990s. Both the victims of the Hog Trail Murders, as well as those known as the Fort Myers 8, are officially believed to have been killed by Daniel Conahan Jr., a notorious and brutal killer who lived in Florida throughout the 90s and is currently sitting on death row after having been found guilty of 1 murder. This is Trace Evidence, Special Case Update, the Fort Myers 8. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine 2 updates regarding a case previously covered on Trace Evidence in episode 129, the case of the Fort Myers 8. Before getting into the updates, just a few quick notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, episode breakdowns, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions through the website or by emailing me directly at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. Throughout the early 1990s, a serial killer was targeting men, ranging in age from their 20s to their 40s, throughout southwestern Florida. In March of 2007, the skeletal remains of 8 men were found in a wooded lot in Fort Myers. 3 of those victims were previously identified, but now a 4th has had his name returned. In addition to this, another victim believed to have died at the hands of the same serial killer has also had his name returned. This is a special case update, episode 129, the Fort Myers 8. Fort Myers, sitting along the edge of Florida's southwestern coast in Lee County, is known to many as the gateway to the Southwest. Already home to nearly 90,000 people, Fort Myers is a major tourist destination that welcomes more than 5 million visitors every year. People come from all over the country and the world to experience the sun and fun of Fort Myers, where they can walk along sandy white beaches, sail to neighboring islands, fish, shop, or stay at numerous resorts, visit restaurants, and clubs. For the vast majority of visitors and residents, it's a beautiful area filled with exciting adventures, quiet sunsets, and cool blue waters. Of course, every city has its bad aspects, and Fort Myers is no different. Whether it be a dangerous part of town that should be avoided, petty crimes, or in some cases major ones, it becomes quite clear that looking like a paradise on earth doesn't necessarily mean there isn't a touch of hell to be fearful of. While the touristy locations are well documented and continue to draw in visitors, there are parts of Fort Myers that your average vacationer would never see. Far from picturesque beaches, crowded shops, and relaxing resort escapes, there are many quiet, more isolated locations where locals travel and visit, but outsiders rarely do. Just like the hot spots, the lesser-known locales offer their own sense of wonder and beauty, but as is to be expected, not every out-of-the-way spot is remembered for the good things that happen there. So many places across the world hold dark secrets from the past, some which are uncovered and revealed for all to see, others which continue to linger somewhere out of sight, waiting to be found. For Fort Myers, that discovery came in the winter of 2007. On the morning of Friday, March 23rd, an ecologist was making his way to Fort Myers to examine a 10-acre lot by a company seeking to develop the area. The lot, filled with trees and an overgrowth of weeds, was located near the end of Arcadia Street, not far from the Eastwood Golf Course. Arriving in the area, the ecologist turned onto a dirt road and followed it to where the lot was so he could look over the location in hopes of determining whether or not that spot would be ripe for new construction. Not long after stepping from his vehicle and entering the lot, the man would make a grisly discovery. Noticing something jutting out from the earth, the man slowly proceeded forward and began brushing back dirt from the object, which appeared to have a whitish tint. After removing an inch or so of dirt, the ecologist leapt to his feet and stepped back in horror as he realized that the unknown object was actually a human skull, which had been partially swallowed up by the soil. With trembling hands, the man ran back towards his car where he retrieved his phone and dialed 911, phoning in his report between heavy, shaky breaths. While authorities initially believed they had a single crime on their hands, that belief would quickly change as examination of the scene would reveal that this was far from an isolated crime. When investigators arrived on the scene, they were somewhat surprised to find that the skull was not found buried deep in the 10-acre plot, but instead was no more than 25 feet from the nearby dirt road. Very early on in the process, several police vehicles arrived on the scene as crime scene technicians from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement were called in to sift the dirt and reveal more of the body, according to the Fort Myers News Press. As crime scene technicians worked, removing the earth from around the skull, they slowly revealed more bones, eventually digging out a complete human skeleton, though it had not been buried deep. Reports suggest that the bones were under less than 2 inches of soil, though it's unknown if this was due to whoever had placed the remains there or if flooding had changed the topography. It was later theorized that the body had been placed on the ground, not actually buried, and that the soil had shifted over time, accounting for the few inches of cover. The body, which police estimated had been there for several years, was barren but for the bones. There were no immediate signs of trauma, nor were there any items discovered outside of the bones. No personal effects, no shreds of clothing. It was also noted that the bones showed signs that animals in the area had chewed on them, and as a result, some were scattered. Technicians were working in a wide circle, clearing dirt and debris when, much to their surprise, they discovered a second set of bones not far from the first. Before investigators could even consider the possibilities, a third set of human remains were quickly discovered within that same tight circle. What had initially appeared to be the site of a single victim began looking like the dumping site utilized by a potential serial killer. In hopes of determining what exactly they were dealing with, investigators reached out to Heather Walsh Haney, a forensic anthropologist who was teaching at Florida Gulf Coast University. Walsh Haney would be faced with the difficult challenge of not only determining how the victims had died, but also who they might be. In regard to the cause of death, Walsh Haney explained that due to the lack of tissue and organs, the exact cause of death might be difficult to determine. When asked how long she believed the remains had been there, Walsh Haney replied, quote, "In Florida, because of the humid environment, you can get a skeleton within a few weeks." End quote. Walsh Haney was one of the first people called into the scene to assist, as crime scene technicians had already been joined by members of the medical examiner's office. It was a difficult task, to be sure. Considering the condition of the bodies being completely skeletal, there was little information given by the bones, at least in terms of a cause of death. However, while it was initially believed that they had discovered only the remains of 3 individuals, it seemed every time the dig operation widened the circle by a few more feet, they'd find another body. In total, over the course of that first day's expedition, investigators discovered more than 1,600 bones connected to the full skeletal remains of 8 different individuals. All 8 skeletons were found within a tight 200-yard radius, with each body being no more than 50 feet from the others. John Douglas, the former FBI profiler, was asked about the discovery and expressed that the absence of clothing and personal effects made it more than likely in his mind that the site was used by a serial killer. He went on to add, quote, "If you're in the business of killing people, that's a great disposal area. You've got the remoteness, the elements, the heat, the insects, animal predation. You put a body out there, and probably within a week or so, there's not going to be much left." End quote. In addition to Walsh Haney, a botanist and an entomologist were brought to the dig site to examine plants and insects in hopes of determining just how long the bodies had been in that location, according to the Tallahassee Democrat. It would take several months before police were able to shed any light on the victims, but on June 8th, a press conference was held to discuss what had been learned. Walsh Haney's work determined that they were dealing with 8 men, 7 of whom were confirmed to be Caucasian, while 1 was considered to possibly be of Hispanic origin. The age range for the victims was between 18 and 49. In general, the victims had signs that, at some point, they had been well nourished and taken care of, with many of the victims showing a history of dental work. One particular victim, given the nature of his teeth and the absence of recent care, was considered likely to have been living a transient lifestyle, though it was later said that many of the victims appeared to have sustained injuries and wear throughout life, which may have suggested that, at some point, they had found themselves either homeless or living in a very difficult situation. Investigators were facing a complicated puzzle. They now had confirmed the remains of 8 males, but they had no way to determine who they might be or how they had been killed. In hopes of finding some answers, police reached out to the public through the media asking for anyone who had any missing persons in the area to reach out to them, with the hopes that they might be able to identify some of the victims. Some bones were sent to a DNA lab operating out of Texas to extract DNA in hopes of identifying the victims, while the skulls were delivered to Sharon Long of Laramie, Wyoming. Long has degrees in both art and anthropology and has worked with the Smithsonian Institute to reconstruct faces from bone. Long was able to construct approximations of the victims' facial appearances based on the bone structure after creating rubber molds from the skulls themselves. Long explained part of the process to CBS News, saying that teeth width is used to determine lip size, the angle of the nasal cavity can help determine nose shape, and that nose shape and size also helps determine ear shape and size. Each recreation took approximately 70 hours to construct, but ultimately, Long was able to create representations for each man, which were then photographed and provided to newspapers for publication. Police received hundreds of calls from the families of missing persons as a result of publishing the photos, and within days, they were working with more than 50 families in an attempt to identify the victims. By November of 2007, 8 months after the discovery, they had successfully identified 2 of the men. Eric Kohler, 21 years of age, missing then from Port Charlotte, 30 miles to the northwest, and John C. Blevins, 38, of Fort Myers. Their identities were confirmed by scientists at the University of North Texas Human Identification Center, utilizing the DNA extracted from their bones and then compared to the DNA of living relatives. Both Blevins and Kohler had last been seen in 1995 and both had criminal records. While Kohler was reported missing 4 years later, in 1999, by his aunt, Blevins had never officially been reported missing. Blevins' stepfather, Terry, contacted authorities a day after seeing the artist's recreation. While ultimately it was confirmed that Blevins was one of the victims, Terry himself was frustrated, telling the news press that it did not resemble John that well, and he hoped for the sake of identification that the other sculptures were more accurate. According to Blevins' mother, she had last spoken to her son right around the time he vanished. A third man was later identified, this being Jonathan Tehei. Tehei was known around Fort Myers as a drifter who had disappeared, much like Kohler and Blevins, in 1995, just days before what would have been his 26th birthday. Natalie Worthington, Tehei's half-sister, contacted authorities after learning about the Fort Myers 8. DNA provided by Worthington wasn't conclusive enough for an ID since they were half siblings, and both of TA's parents had since passed away, his mother dying just 4 months before the discovery. However, a hairbrush she left behind still had strands of her hair in it. Soon, DNA analysis was able to confirm that Jonathan Tehei was indeed one of the Fort Myers 8. While Tehei was not officially identified until early 2008, he thus far has been the last of the men whose identities have been discovered. For investigators, that leaves 5 unknown victims who have yet to yield any results. And while knowing their identities would certainly assist in the investigation, based on the histories of these 3 men, it began becoming more clear that whoever had killed the 8 men had likely been in the habit of picking up or spending time with transient men, or perhaps men who were out on their own, disconnected from family and friends. Unfortunately, due to the nature of the remains being skeletal, no cause of death has ever officially been revealed by investigators, though whether or not one is known is unknown. Several articles have gone on to speculate that the cause of death may be related to strangulation, as nothing has ever been found to connect the remains to massive physical traumas such as stabbings or shootings. After investigators had completed their grid search of the 10-acre lot, it was announced they had found no weapons, nor had they been able to recover any bullets or other evidence which might help illuminate the ways in which the 8 men had been killed. All police truly knew was that they were dealing with homicides. While there was a limitless amount of speculation about a potential killer, there was one name that kept coming up: Daniel Conahan Jr. Conahan is a suspected serial killer who targeted men he sexually assaulted and tortured before killing them, often by ligature strangulation. In February of 1994, the unidentified remains of a man were discovered in an isolated wooded part of Port Charlotte. A medical examiner was later able to determine that the victim was between the ages of 25 and 35, though his identity is unknown to this day. Nothing was found at the scene, no clothing or personal effects. 2 years later, in 1996, a family dog returned home with a grisly find: a human skull. Investigators flooded the area and began a grid search. More victims were discovered, totaling 4. Each victim had been found nude and with their genitals mutilated. Some of the victims had apparent rope burns from binding, and subsequently, investigators searched and were able to find marks on trees, suggesting that the victims may have been tied to the trees at the time they were tortured and killed. Over the years, investigators were able to identify some of the victims who had been found, those being John William Millerano, Richard Allen Montgomery, and Kenneth Lee Smith. It became apparent quite quickly that investigators were dealing with a serial killer, and soon the case was labeled as the Hog Trail killings, as some of the victims had been located in areas where hog hunters were often spending time. The crimes had been spread out across Charlotte and Sarasota counties, 30 minutes to the north of Fort Myers. Several people directed investigators to take a look at Daniel Conahan Jr., a 42-year-old unemployed nurse living in the area. According to the Orlando Sentinel, Conahan was arrested on July 5th, 1996, for the kidnapping and attempted murder of Stanley Burden. According to official reports, Conahan had offered Burden money in exchange for posing for bondage photos. Conahan led Burden into the woods, at which time he bound him to a tree and attempted to sexually assault him. Burden fought back to the best of his ability, at which time Conahan attempted to strangle him. After struggling with Burden, Conahan apparently got frustrated and left, leaving his victim nude and bound to a tree. Burden managed to escape and later told his story to police. During their investigation, police executed a search warrant on Conahan's apartment. Several items were found connecting him not only to the attack on Burden, but also to the murder of Richard Allen Montgomery. A paint chip had been found near the victim, and that chip was matched to the paint of Conahan's car, and fibers from both Conahan's car and home matched those found on the victim. During the trial, Burden testified against Conahan, as did 2 undercover officers who had posed as gay men and reported having been approached by Conahan, who propositioned them with taking nude photos in exchange for money. Ultimately, Conahan was found guilty of Montgomery's torture and murder, at which time he was sentenced to death. However, investigators believe Conahan is likely responsible for all of the Hog Trail killings. They simply don't have enough evidence to officially file charges. Of course, considering the nature of the discoveries in terms of the Fort Myers 8, investigators became extremely suspicious of the fact that while some of Conahan's alleged dumping grounds had been discovered years earlier, it was entirely possible that the 8 victims found in Fort Myers could have been directly connected. Perhaps the most intriguing detail revolved around the fact that Stanley Burden, the man who had managed to escape from Conahan, had been attacked less than a mile from the location where 6 years later, all 8 skeletons would be found. The timeline seemed to match up as well, with the 8 victims believed to have disappeared during the mid-90s, right around the time that Conahan is alleged to have been committing all of the Hog Trail murders. However, due to the inability to identify all of the victims, police have not been able to confirm exactly when they were killed. It's believed the range could be as wide as 1987 to 2001, the later portion of which would rule out Conahan, as he was arrested in 1996 and convicted in 1999. Fort Myers Police Detective Sergeant Jennifer Soto confirmed that investigators were trying to make a connection to Conahan, though she would not state that there was any direct connection, telling the Statesboro Herald, quote, "We certainly can't exclude him at this point. We are very well aware of the similarities in this case. It's one avenue that we are actively pursuing," end quote. One issue which has been brought up by those who do not believe Conahan was responsible revolves around the method of disposal. In the Hog Trail murders, the killer had often posed the victims and their remains were found spread out over 2 counties, whereas in Fort Myers, all 8 victims were found within 50 yards of one another. While some believe this suggests a different hand was at work, others have argued that Conahan's methods may have simply evolved over time, as they have seen with other serial killers. Conahan had a method of sexually assaulting and mutilating victims, but since the 8 bodies found were completely skeletal, it was impossible for forensic examiners to confirm the manner of death, let alone any sexual assault, torture, or mutilation which may have occurred either pre- or post-mortem. Investigators believe that Conahan had a type, for lack of a better term. There were characteristics shared by his victims which he seemed to specifically be drawn to, but again, with only 3 of the 8 positively identified, it couldn't be confirmed if all of the victims shared this particular look or not. Some similarities have been noted based upon the 3 victims who have been identified. At the time of his death, Eric Kohler was 21, the same age as Montgomery had been when he was killed. During the time that police were investigating Conahan for his crime against Burden, they conducted surveillance which found him visiting parks in the Fort Myers area, specifically locations where drifters were known to gather. When Conahan was later questioned about the Fort Myers 8, he denied any responsibility, but it should be noted that he denies that he ever attacked or killed anyone, even the man he is convicted of having murdered. Conahan is looked at by many as the likely killer, but there are details that raise concerns. This, of course, presents another problem for investigators. If it wasn't Conahan who was responsible for the deaths of the Fort Myers 8, they very well may have had, or perhaps still do have, another serial killer operating in that area. Each of the 5 remaining unidentified men are listed in NamUs and show that each has had more than 10 comparisons tested and ruled out. I should note, though, some of the men have been compared to missing persons disappearing as late as 2005, suggesting the possibility that the 1987 to 2001 window may have been widened, though there does not appear to be any official confirmation of this. For more than 13 years now, these men's identities have remained undetermined, and any potential link their identities may provide to their killer is hidden. In 2019, investigators enlisted the assistance of Miami-Dade Police Department's forensic artist Samantha Steinberg to update the facial reconstructions. It's been hoped that these new, more detailed constructions might aid investigators in identifying the 5 remaining John Does. Case update. In early June of 2021, detectives with the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office announced they had identified remains discovered 27 years earlier in 1994. Wyandotte Avenue was known as the Hog Trail due to the large population of wild boars in the area. The remote location was a popular spot for hunters and people looking to spend some time alone. On Tuesday, February 1st, the sheriff's office received a call from a construction worker who reported finding decomposing human remains in the woods near Wyandotte Avenue and Tulip Street. According to WINK News, at the time of the discovery, the remains were so badly decomposed that they could not be properly identified. They officially designated the victim as John Doe Number 1. In hopes of generating more information and giving a better look at how the victim may have appeared in life, a clay model was constructed. Utilizing the shape of the skull and a little bit of guesswork, the model was designed to approximate the features of the victim. Unfortunately, while this resulted in a large amount of calls coming into investigators from the families of missing persons, none of them could be matched to the unknown victim. 2 years later, on Monday, January 1st, 1996, a dog belonging to a family in Northport brought home a human skull. When investigators were called, they managed to locate the rest of the remains in a wooded area off Plamondon Street. The position in which the body had been found would later be noted as sharing very close similarities to bodies found a few months later. This victim, officially named John Doe Number 2, remains unidentified to this day. A cause of death could not be determined, though the medical examiner did say he believed the victim had died as the result of a homicide. The victim was described as being male, between 35 and 45 years old, standing just over 6 feet tall. The man had brown hair and what has been described as a heavy build. 2 months later, on Thursday, March 7th, a traveler who stopped to urinate in a wooded area 4 miles away discovered the lifeless body of another man. Authorities at the time determined that the victim had been killed recently and his body had been in the woods for no more than 7 to 10 days. Dubbed John Doe Number 3, he would remain unknown for 3 years until he was positively identified as 36-year-old John William Millerano. Originally from Cleveland, John moved to Northport less than 2 months before he was killed. Investigators noted that John appeared to have been bound across his chest, though evidence suggested he had briefly escaped. Injuries to his body indicated that he had been chased through the woods, naked, before the killer caught up to him and finished the job. According to WSB-TV News 2, a palm tree found less than 20 feet from John's body had marks on it, suggesting that he had been tied to the tree before his escape attempt. Finding these marks, investigators returned to the location where John Doe Number 2's body had been found, and they noted a palm tree nearby shared similar marks. 1 month later, on Wednesday, April 17th, 2 county workers found human remains near Tremblay Avenue and Willow Drive, less than a mile north from the aforementioned body. While searching the woods for additional evidence, another body was found. This third body had recently been covered over with foam material, sometimes described as carpet padding. The body only had been present for around 1 day. Detectives later revealed the victim had his genitals mutilated and there were marks on his body suggesting he had been bound. This third body would be identified as Richard Montgomery of Punta Gorda, 15 miles to the southeast. The medical examiner was able to determine that both Richard and the second victim found near him had been killed, labeling their cases as homicide. Months later, the second body was positively identified as Kenneth Smith, a resident of Fort Myers. In addition to the unidentified man, Montgomery, and Smith, 2 other bodies had been found in different wooded areas in the Northport area, 5 miles to the northwest. 1 year later, in May of 1997, a county worker found skeletal human remains near Quesada Avenue, just a few miles from the wooded area where John Doe Number 1 was found. A few months later, investigators confirmed this victim's identity as being 24-year-old William Charles Patton, a landscaper who had been reported missing by his family 4 years earlier in 1993. Ultimately, investigators would form a task force which would attempt to discover the identities and potential connections between all of the victims, including the two found in different areas. Daniel Conahan Jr. was considered a viable suspect at the time and would be arrested and charged with the murder of Richard Montgomery. He'd be found guilty and sentenced to death. He remains on death row to this day. While Conahan was considered the most likely suspect for all of the murders, he could only be linked to Montgomery. As a result, the other murders have gone unprosecuted, and the first victim remained unidentified. By the early 2000s, DNA technology was developing at a rapid rate and began being utilized to help identify unknown victims who remained listed as Jane and John Doe's. Nearly 30 years after the discovery of John Doe Number 1's remains, a relative who uploaded their DNA to Ancestry.com was found by genealogical researchers working with cold case investigators. Detectives were able to positively identify those remains as being Gerald Jerry Lombard, who had disappeared from Lowell, Massachusetts in 1991. Danielle Nemec last saw her father Jerry when she was around 4 or 5 years old. One day, he left the family home and never returned, leading Danielle to struggle with the possibility that her father had abandoned the family, perhaps because he didn't want children. As time progressed on, she started believing it was more likely that her father had died, or perhaps had been killed, and was a John Doe out there somewhere waiting to be found and identified. She had no way of knowing that her darkest thoughts would actually turn out to be true. Jerry's sister, Carol Dufresne, acknowledged that throughout his life, her brother had always been a sort of wandering type person, seeking out where next he might find his happiness. She explained to WINK, saying, quote, "He was always one to never sit still. He was always on the go. The last I spoke with him was in 1991. Carol's husband, Robert, had attempted to track down her missing brother several times over the years, but he could never pick up the trail, telling reporters that it was like he just fell off the face of the earth. When investigators made a connection to DNA submitted to Ancestry.com by Jerry's niece, they realized that there was a likely familial relationship to the victim. Reaching out, they requested additional DNA samples from other family members, and it was Jerry's son Ryan who came back as a perfect match. After 27 long years, investigators were able to confirm that Jerry Lombard had been killed and dumped along the Hog Trail in 1994. The family has described the call as bittersweet, finally putting an end to the question of Jerry's fate, but it wasn't the happy ending they had been hoping for. By the time he was identified, both of Jerry's parents had passed away, but he had many siblings, 16, who had wondered for years what had become of him. According to them, Jerry's mother always believed something terrible had to have happened to her son, as she never believed he would walk away and not come back. Jerry's siblings were unsure of what to think, so when they were contacted by Detective Mike Vogel, they initially thought it was a prank call. They knew things were serious when they contacted the sheriff's department, who confirmed that Vogel did in fact work for them. So finally, after nearly 30 years, the identity of John Doe Number 1 has been confirmed. For the family of Jerry Lombard, the answer offers a certain level of comfort, but it also reminds them of how important family is and how little time we have. Since Daniel Conahan Jr. is currently on death row for the murder of Richard Montgomery, investigators have tried to get him to talk about the bodies found along the Hog Trail and in Fort Myers, but he refuses to engage or answer questions about any of the crimes. Now, we turn our attention towards the second update in this case. While Fort Myers investigators previously identified 3 of their 8 victims, those being 24-year-old Jonathan Tehey, 21-year-old Eric Kohler, and 26-year-old Jonathan Blevins, there were 5 additional victims who they had not managed to identify. On Tuesday, September 6, 2022, detectives announced they had successfully identified the remains of a 4th victim as being 30-year-old Robert Ronald Bobby Sodden. Robert had been last in contact with his family when he was 30 years old in 1996. According to a spokesperson for the Fort Myers police, Robert's identification was the result of cold case detectives working in conjunction with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and Parabon Nanolabs based out of Virginia. A statement issued by the department explained, quote, "Based on the data that was searched, a family tree was developed that identified the probable identity of the person. Cold case investigators then located direct relatives of the potential victim and completed direct comparison DNA with the Department of Law Enforcement. The comparison confirmed the identity of Sodden." End quote. While Robert now has his name returned to him, there remains a lot of mystery about his life and how he ended up in the Fort Myers area. Public record searches conducted by investigators tracked down a listing for Robert living in an apartment in the city in the mid-90s. Tracking down family members was somewhat more complicated, as detectives found blood relatives living in Washington, New Jersey, and North Carolina. Not a great deal of information has, as of yet, been released about Robert's life, nor have any details regarding his family been issued. During the course of my research for this update, I was able to find several pieces of information about Robert's life. However, given the fact that his family hasn't said anything publicly yet, and investigators aren't showing much either, I think it would be inappropriate for me to share what I have found. If his family decides to speak about the case publicly, I'll be more than ready to provide additional updates. However, they need time to come to terms with the truth and to grieve, so we should respect their privacy during this difficult time. The Fort Myers police have made a public plea asking that anyone who knew Robert in life contact them so that they might learn more about his comings and goings, social groups, any issues he may have had with anyone, or anyone who may have wanted to harm him. While detectives believe that Daniel Conahan Jr. is responsible for Robert's murder, as well as everyone else we've discussed today, without additional information, they can't make that link. Asked about the investigation, the Fort Myers police issued a press statement saying, in part, quote, "The investigation will not stop until all 8 of the victims are identified and their families notified." End quote. Matt Alberto, an investigator with the Fort Myers Police Department, has been working on the case alongside Detective Mike Vogel. Both agree that this is most likely the work of a serial killer, and while all signs point to Conahan, they don't have enough evidence to charge him with any other murders. Asked whether or not he'd ever spoken to Conahan about the crimes, Alberto told Fox 4 News, quote, "Well, he and I talked several years ago. He denied any knowledge of any of the victims here, or Charlotte, or anywhere else. He continues to fight for his innocence about the death he was convicted of, and really just didn't want to participate in any conversation about it." End quote. Returning Robert Sodden's name is another step in the process, and a good one, which leaves us now with 4 of the 8 remaining to be identified. Alberto, discussing this update, informed the media that they were already working on unlocking a 5th victim's identity, utilizing the same approach that worked for Robert. We can only hope that, sooner than later, the names of all of Conahan's alleged victims in Fort Myers, as well as Charlotte County and elsewhere, will have their names returned to them, and that evidence will be unlocked to officially charge him, granting some semblance of justice to the families who have lost loved ones at his vicious hands. If you're looking for more information about the Hog Trail Murders or the Fort Myers 8, there are many news sources available online who have done comprehensive coverage of the cases, updates, and Daniel Conahan Jr. himself. If you have any information about the murder of Jerry Lombard or any of the other victims found in Charlotte County or Sarasota, please contact the Florida Department of Law Enforcement at 850-410-7000. If you have any information about Robert Sodden or any of the Fort Myers 8 victims, please contact the Fort Myers Police Department at 239-321-7700. If you have any information about any of these cases or any other Florida cases in that area, you can contact Southwest Florida Crime Stoppers at 1-800-780-8477. You can also visit their website at southwestcrimestoppers.com, where you can anonymously submit information. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to thank our very amazing Patreon producers. Thank you to Alicia Townsend, Amy Guthrie, Andrew Guarino, Ann Bertram, Brittany Bivens, Christine Greco, Denise Dingsdale, Donna Buttram, Diane Dyson, Eamon Brady, Eloanne Meyer, Fabulous TT, Greg, Guillermo Pinto, Haley Christie, James, Jennifer Winkler, Jill Sense, Joni Berkowitz, Julie Mangano, Kara Moreland, Lars Jensen Fengel, Leslie B., Marla Wright, Melissa Breckeisen, Nick Mohar Schurz, Quinn McBreen, Sarah Lyons, Susie the Cutie, Travis Skepko, Stacy Finnegan, Stephanie Joyner, Stephanie Eve, Tiffany Nelson, Tom Archer, and Tom Radford. Thank you so much for your amazing support. Without you, this show would not be possible. If you're interested in learning more about this case or other cases featured on the show, please visit trace-evidence.com. There you can find case breakdowns, all social media links, merchandise shops, case descriptions, media, and options for donating, including PayPal and Patreon, should you wish to support the show. This concludes our update for the Fort Myers 8. As always, I'll continue to stay updated on the case, and should more information or new identifications be revealed, I'll be certain to drop another update episode. Quick scheduling note here, I'm going to be taking next week off, so the next episode will drop on Thursday, October 6th. Again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll join me in October for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.